Here's what Pastor Piper says. Advent is a season for waiting. Of course, we are not waiting, he says, for the birth of Christ any longer. But we are awaiting the second advent of Christ, his return to earth. Right away, I just want to comment that I like the fact that he talks about the coming of Yeshua in both aspects. He says we're not waiting for the birth of Christ, but we're awaiting the second advent. And he uses that word advent, meaning the coming of Christ. And we're going to find out that when we look at Yeshua coming to earth and interacting with human beings, it is entirely proper to refer to his arrival, his coming, his presence here on earth with the Greek word parousia. And this, or some people say parousia, but Parousia in the transliterated Greek using English letters, Latin alphabet. But I pronounce it as parousia. So the parousia is the presence, literally translated as not really coming of Christ. It's the arrival. It's a better way to translate that Greek word, but with the view of presence of whoever has arrived. The idea, going back to this ancient Greek concept of a ruler or a king or an emperor or a Caesar coming to a town or a city, somewhere other than the throne, other than the royal palace where he resides most of the time. He's going to go out and visit his subjects, and he's going to come into a town. Of course, all of this is pre-announced with pomp and circumstance and all kinds of fanfare, right? I mean, it's the king, it's the emperor, it's the Caesar, it's the ruler of our place, it's the guy who's keeping us safe and providing for us, etc., etc. So what would end up happening is the people of the town would go out to meet him right at maybe the edge of the town's border, or go out to the town square at the very least, the main street, whatever you want to call it, and they would hold a parade, and they'd have all these celebrations and joyous festivities and et cetera, et cetera. And they would, in other words, rather than just waiting for him to come into town and then they go meet him, they would anticipate and know that he's coming because he announced it in advance. He told them he was coming, and they would go out and meet him first, and then he would meet them at that edge, and they would actually accompany him, or escort him, as it were, back into town. And so we can see this in the Gospels, where Yeshua is coming in, right, what we call the Passion Week, where he's riding into Jerusalem on a donkey, and he is met by the people, the throngs, the crowds of people, putting palm branches on, we call this Palm Sunday, putting the palm branches on the ground, and they're welcoming this king. By this time, he's publicly announcing his title as Messiah and King of the Jews, etc., etc. He's riding on a donkey. They're welcoming him. There's shouts of a Hosanna, etc., etc. And so, Hosanna to him who comes, the King of the Jews. So that's the idea of parousia, is going out to meet the prominent ruler, the designated important person. The people go out to meet him where they're at. They don't just sit still. They go. I keep emphasizing this for a reason. They go to meet him, and then the two of them, the people and whoever the leader is, they all come back to the city. This becomes important for the post-trib view, which says that the rapture is not us just sitting around waiting for Jesus to come and rescue us and snatch us away from planet Earth. Rather, we have to move up to meet him in the air. And then, rather than continue our journey upward into the stratosphere, into heaven, then instead they say that, according to this word parousia, we go up, we meet the Lord in the air, and then we all come back down to earth to welcome the Lord to earth, and he establishes his 1,000-year kingdom. And that's why the post-trib that's one of the reasons why they put the rapture and the second coming as the same event, basically, which is entirely, like I said, is very Hebraic. It's because it's based on Old Testament types. It's also very New Testament because we can see it happening. We've got good reason to believe that this is the best meaning of the word parousia. And so it's no wonder that a lot of prominent Bible teachers, especially those who are in Messianic circles, hold to the post-trib. John Piper is not Messianic, I'm sorry. Yeah, messianic in the sense of Torah, pro-Torah, Torah observant, that type of Bible teacher, Christian teacher. But he's post-trib for a number of reasons that we're going to read about tonight. Dr. Michael Brown, well-known apologist, messianic apologist, probably the most widely recognized, well-known, foremost Jewish apologist on the planet today. He is proudly post-trib. Dr. Craig Keener is also post-trib, if I remember. He and Dr. Brown did a book and a video series on why they're not pre-trib and things like that. So they contrast the post with the pre, and both of them, if I remember right, are post. And there's a lot of other Bible teachers. Brother Joel Richardson, who we used his materials when we looked at the Islamic Antichrist. He is also, he by definition, he is post-trib, although he has a lot of pre-wrath respect, and he'll sometimes say that he's kind of a hybrid between pre-wrath and post-trib, but based on the definitions of what post-tribbers teach, he admits that he must be post-trib there as well. A lot of Messianics that I interact with at Messianic congregations, based on the details that surround post-trib that we're going to start reading about, they are also post-trib. So let's begin to read a little bit about post-trib. So here's Pastor John Piper, his answer on what is the rapture and when is it. He continues, those two advents are not far removed from one another. I'm sorry, I realized that I broke off my thought about why I stopped and talked about advent. It's because the word parousia, from most perspectives, is the presence of Christ, not just the arrival, and not just the movement, not just the coming, but the presence. And when we think about the first presence, where Yeshua was here on planet Earth, his presence included a number of activities that spanned the time frame from his birth to his being raised, which are kind of silent years. We don't know about what happened we have a lot of details in the Bible about his birth, and then there's a kind of huge gap where we just don't know what he was doing. We have some minor details, when he was 12 years old or something like that, needs in the temple, interacting with some of the religious leaders there, Pharisees, Sadducees, etc. But then we don't really know a lot about Yeshua's life until he finally enters public ministry, gets baptized by John the Baptist, enters into public ministry, starts doing miracles, etc., fighting with the religious leaders, culminating in his being tried and then hung on the cross, and then his time in the tomb, and then the resurrection, and then the time with the disciples after the resurrection, and then finally the ascension and sitting at the right hand of the Father, and then the sending of the Holy Spirit, his Holy Spirit, at Pentecost. Well, all of that is inclusive of the first Advent. That's the point I'm bringing up. Advent, when we talk about the parousia, the arrival of Christ, the first time included all of those events that I just described. But with equal detail, the second coming of Christ isn't just the rapture. The second parousia, and there's only two. There's the first parousia and the second parousia. The second parousia, the second coming of Christ, is not just the arrival or the coming or the rapture. Properly, the parousia, which is just one, includes the rapture. But if we're going to be fair and honest, we're going to begin to notice that there are a lot of other events that Yeshua has to fulfill. Namely, we have the rapture, we have the battle at Armageddon, the second coming, we have the wrath of the Lord itself, the day of the Lord, the wrath of God being poured out by Yeshua. We have all of that. We have, as I mentioned, the Battle of Armageddon, but we also have a number of other things, such as the salvation of Israel that needs to take place. We also have the sheep and goat judgment that needs to take place. We have the marriage supper of the Lamb that needs to take place. We have the Bema seat judgment that needs to take place. And then we have the millennial kingdom that needs to take place. And then after the millennial kingdom, we have another battle that takes place. We also have the Great White Throne Judgment that takes place near the end. All of that, everything I just described, starting with rapture and ending with, say, Great White Throne Judgment, there are a lot of activities that need to take place, and yet all of that is parousia. All of that is Christ's presence, the second time here on planet Earth, right? Because whenever Christ is here on Earth, bodily, that's parousia, that's presence. So, Pastor John called it Advent here in this article. That's why I said the Advent is a season of waiting. We're not waiting for the birth of Christ any longer, but we are waiting the second Advent, meaning the second parousia, which includes all of these different events. That's going to become important as we begin to ask the questions, how many times is Christ coming back? Is the rapture one coming and the second coming another coming? Is that two? Are there two second comings of Christ? And there's a lot of internet traffic, internet chatter that tries to make sense of what event is the rapture and what event is the second coming. Is it one event but two aspects, two bookends, two perspectives, whatever? What do we call it? Events that are really connected by one, or are they two separate events? Are there two second comings? This will make a little bit more sense as we read Pastor John's notes here. So let me just read down through his notes, and then you'll see why I brought this up. Why I'm not just rambling on for no reason. Those two advents are not far removed from one another, nor should they be, he says. Christmas is a very fitting time to dwell on the return of Christ. But, Pastor Piper says, will Christ return in the future once or twice? Notice the question. Will Christ return in the future once or twice? It's a good question from a listener named Nick, right? And I don't think that is Saint Nick. Okay, that's just my own humorous addition to his article here. All right, so here's the question. Pastor John, I know this is a huge debate, but this is Nick talking, but I would love your thoughts. How many times is Jesus coming back? Is he coming back in the rapture, according to 1 Thessalonians 4:16 and 17, and then returning a second time to defeat Satan, according to Revelation 19:11 and 21? Is Christ returning one more time or two more times? Now, it seems like a very simple question, and some might say, well, it's got a simple answer, but it doesn't get that simple when you consider all of the four different views and trying to make sense of rapture versus second coming. Remember, let me just look at some of the charts. According to most of the charts, there are at least two events. There's rapture on the far left and second coming on the far right of any one of these given charts. But the post-trib puts rapture and second coming right on top of one another. So let's look at Pastor John's answer. Here's his answer. My understanding of the New Testament is that Jesus promised he would return, and that in this returning, he would do a final rescue for those who are trusting him, and a final judgment for those who are not believing in him. Notice very carefully the two events that Pastor Piper is describing: the final rescue and a final judgment. Let's continue. Pastor Piper says, I don't think there are two comings of Christ in the future, but only one. Now, again, since we know in advance, since I've told you that Pastor John Piper, according to this article, at the time of writing, which was 2012, I don't know if he's changed his position since then, since some time has gone by, right? That's been more than 10 years ago. But when he wrote this article, he was decidedly post-trib. And he says, I don't think there are two comings of Christ in the future, but only one. So when we look at the post-trib chart, there we go, we see that the rapture and the second coming are right next to each other. Therefore, they would be one event and one coming of Christ, not two. However, in all fairness, I myself, being a pre-wrather, I don't think there are two comings either. However, I do think there are two events. Rapture and second coming are two different events, but it's one parousia, one coming. How can I maintain that? Well, when you look at the, when you look at the chart of rapture, the rapture and the second coming are separated by the wrath of God, God's wrath, day of the Lord. However, that event known as God's wrath or day of the Lord is one single event that has multiple activities associated with it, right? There's a lot of stuff that's going to be taking place in that time frame. And at the very least, if we take Scripture in its most natural, literal sense, how long is God's wrath? What's the duration of the day of the Lord? Well, at the very, very least, according to my understanding, it is 5 months long. At the very least, I'll tell you why later. So how long is it? How short is it? At the shortest, I put it at 5 months, but it could be a little bit longer, maybe a year, year and a half, etc., etc. But so I have one event called the parousia, aka God's wrath, aka the day of the Lord, aka the coming of Messiah. But there are bookends. There's the first part of the bookend, the front end event, and then the final bookend, the last event. So there are two events, but it's one parousia. So I don't need to say that there are two second comings, although some of the pre-tribbers are pressed into describing tribulation before the 7 years and then second coming at the end. And some of them will describe it as two events. I'm sorry, not two events, definitely two events, but they'll sometimes describe it as coming twice. Once to come for his church and once to come back with his church, etc., etc. But Pastor John is saying, I don't think there are two comings of Christ in the future, but only one. And unfortunately, that doesn't really answer the question of what is rapture and what is second coming. I say it doesn't because all of the other views could equally say we don't believe there are two comings of Christ in the future. We believe there's only one. Yet there are two separate events connected with the one single coming. So Pastor Piper's answer here, unfortunately, is just a bit ambiguous. It contains a little bit of equivocation. I don't know if he was aware of that when he said that, but he repeats his answer. I don't think there are two comings of Christ in the future, only one. And as if that separates his view from the other views. Perhaps it would have helped, in my opinion, if he said, I don't think there are two events. There's only one. If he would have said it that way, I think maybe it would have been a little bit more explanatory. But let's keep reading his view anyway. He continues. Most of those who believe that Christ will come twice, notice he sets up what could be construed as a straw man perspective of the other three views if he says those who believe that Christ will come twice. That the first return, the first of the two, he says, is the coming of the Lord to snatch away the church out of the world, called the rapture. So he says, he describes this as those who believe that Christ will come twice. Well, again, if you put all four of the views in a room and had a representative from each of those views and ask them, how many times will Christ come again? I think all four of them are going to say Christ is only going to come again once. But it sounds like only three of them would say that there are two aspects or events, two primary events associated with the second coming. One of those events being the rapture, the other event being the second coming or the glorious return. It goes through a few different nicknames. Rapture is the most popular of the first of the two events, and then the last one is, like I said, something just called the second coming or the glorious presence or something that effect. I had a little chart on here earlier that looked like this, that just shows them as rapture on the left, second coming on the right, and we can see from this chart that they definitely have differing details associated with the events, giving us the conclusion that there are two separate events, but how far they're separated from one another, we don't know. So going back to Pastor Piper, he says those who believe that Christ will come twice. I'm not one of those people, but if you ask me, are rapture and the second coming the same thing? I'm going to say no, and I'm going to say I believe there must be a time frame that separates the two, a duration of time between the two that allows for X number of truths to be realized, certain Bible passages and prophecies to be fulfilled in order for the Bible to be taken in its most natural sense. Therefore, that's one of the reasons that you're going to hear me say that I reject the post-trib view, is because they simply don't allow enough time for certain prophecies and Bible verses to be understood most naturally and for certain events to take place namely, like I said, that 5-month time span, which I'm not telling you why I believe that just yet. I'll tell you why later. But suffice to say, he's setting up this difference between those who believe that the first return, that there's that Christ will come twice, and those who believe that Christ will only come once. And again, I'm not sure if he's aware of the ambiguity of saying it that way. But he talks about this word rapture. He continues, this rapture would be a snatching away of the church back to heaven for 7 years. He's talking about the pre-trib, obviously, usually while the great tribulation happens on earth. What you're going to find in most of these blogs that we're going to be going through, and I'm not doing this to pick on a certain view, but what you're going to find is that the pre-trib view, because it's the most popular of all the 4 views out there in Christian circles today, the pre-trib view becomes the whipping boy. It becomes the poster child for what you should not believe about the rapture. The pre-trib view has the unfortunate position of being the one that suffers the most abuse and gets attacked the most by the other 3, as if everyone's picking on the pre-trib view all the time. And again, part of it is because it's the most popular, and if you're occupying the top spot, everyone else is going to take shots at you. That just kind of makes sense. Part of it is because of a lot of people have become, Christian circles have become dissatisfied and disillusioned, and with all of the weak theology that surrounds the pre-trib view, the popularity of it being seen as somewhat superficial, etc., etc. And so the pre-trib view is going to be the one that's contrasted against any other view in just about every blog article that you're ever going to read. Pre-trib versus pre-wrath, pre-trib versus mid-trib, pre-trib versus post-trib. You're always going to find pre-trib being compared to whatever view that you yourself hold to, or no view, the pan-trib version where everything's just going to pan out in the end, versus pre-trib, right? And then so if you do a Google search or a YouTube search for rapture, there are a ton of videos out there on why I don't believe in rapture anymore, or why rapture itself is unbiblical, or why rapture is not taught in the Bible, or rapture hoax or hope, or etc., etc. All of these attacks on rapture are usually using pre-trib as its model when we talk about there's no such thing as rapture. What they're saying really is there's no such thing as pre-trib, secret, anytime, imminent rapture. So there are features of pre-trib that are kind of foundational to its view, such as imminency, the idea that Jesus can come back at any moment, that it's unannounced, that it's signless, that there are no events that have to precede it, and that it is secret, that it's a rapture that's going to happen in the twinkling of an eye so fast that no one on earth will be able to anticipate it, and therefore it's a secret. No one else is going to know about it. So those are some of the aspects, plus the fact that it's pre-trib, that it takes place prior to the tribulation. And then but what a lot of people are finding out is that even at a surface level reading of the Bible, many of those claims, imminency, secrecy, pre-trib itself, many of those claims simply don't hold up to the biblical scrutiny. So that's why a lot of people are abandoning pre-trib. And unfortunately, what they're doing in the process is they're abandoning rapture. So at least I applaud Pastor Piper for taking a view of rapture, retaining rapture, but just rethinking the timing. So he said, and later on we're going to see this in this article, that he actually even confesses that this would be a snatching away, talking about rapture of the church, back to heaven for 7 years, usually while the great tribulation happens on earth. Then he says this is followed by a final, this is kind of the second stage, returning of the Lord to establish his kingdom. So he's going to use the word stages now, which I'm happy that he doesn't completely use the straw man aspect of saying 2 second comings, because that's not quite accurately to the way that many in the other views are describing it. Rather, he should properly say stages. At least that's the way that I'm working with. And then he says, now, I grew up in a home and in a church that believed that view. He's talking about pre-trib. He believed that view called pre-tribulation rapture view. It's called that because, he says, there's a coming of Christ pre or before the tribulation, so that the church is taken out and spared that time of great suffering from the Lord at the end of the age. He continues, the more I studied this for myself, I can remember thinking about this event as a teenager. I just could not find two comings in the future for the Christian church. So he keeps going back and forth between the aspect of two comings and two stages. And as a pre-raptor, I'm going to make a careful distinction between those two terms, pun intended. I don't favor the term two comings, that phrase there, two comings. I prefer the phrase two stages of one coming. Because like Joel Richardson, who himself is also a post-tribber, just like Pastor Piper here, Joel Richardson is really going to hammer the fact that when you read through the Bible, there is only one parousia. There's only one coming of Christ. Now, John Piper, in all fairness, he's going to say that as well. So let's keep reading. I once asked a very reputable Old Testament scholar, a really scholarly Old Testament scholar, who believed this view. And here's the question. What is the most important text that persuades you that before Christ comes in judgment, he will come earlier to take the church out of the world and then only return in judgment 7 years later, or 3.5, maybe? So that's the question that John Piper asked this elderly Christian gentleman. His answer was unhesitating. He said, Revelation 3:10, it says this, because you have kept my word about patient endurance, these are the words of Jesus, of course, I will keep you from the hour of trial that is coming on the whole world to try those who will dwell on the earth. In time, we will also look at that verse, and I'll tell you what I think it means also. End quote for the verse out of the book of Revelation. And this is Pastor John Piper continuing. In other words, speaking of that Old Testament saint that he asked, he thought that verse taught that Christians would be taken out of the world before God brought a great trial or tribulation on the world. But does it? So this is the pre-trib view that John Piper is comparing with the post-trib view that he himself holds to. Pre-trib is a foundation of their theology. It's right in their name, is that Christians will be taken out of the way prior to any tribulation. And if tribulation is equated with wrath, which according to their perspective it is, the proof is verses where Jesus promises to protect us or keep us from the hour of trial, or that we're not destined to wrath, right? The 1 Thessalonians 4:15, I believe, passage. Off the top of my head, I think it's 4:15, but we'll look at that later.